going to read for a little while. Man, human, and I will make errors. Made in America. 1. The Mayflower and before. The image of the spiritual founding of America that generations of Americans have grown up with was created, oddly enough, by a poet of limited talents, to put it in the most magnanimous possible way, who lived 2 centuries after the event in a country 3,000 miles away. Her name was Felicia Dorothea Hemans, and she was not American but Welsh. Indeed, she had never been to America, and appears to have known next to nothing about the country. It just happened that one day in 1826, her local grocer in North Wales wrapped her purchases in a sheet of 2-year-old newspaper from Massachusetts, and her eye was caught by a small article about a Founders' Day celebration in Plymouth. It was very probably the first she had heard of the Mayflower or the Pilgrims, but inspired as only a mediocre poet can be, she dashed off a poem, The Landing of the Pilgrim Fathers in New England, which begins, The breaking waves dashed high on a stern and rock-bound coast, and the woods against a stormy sky, their giant branches tossed. And the heavy night hung dark, the hills and water o'er, when a band of exiles moored their bark on the wild New England shore. And it continues in a vigorously grandiloquent, indeterminately rhyming vein for a further 8 stanzas. Although the poem was replete with errors, the Mayflower was not a bark. It was not a night when they moored. Plymouth was not where they first trod, but in fact their 4th landing site. It became an instant classic and formed the essential image of the Mayflower landing that most Americans carry with them to this day. The one thing the Pilgrims certainly didn't do was step ashore on Plymouth Rock. Quite apart from the consideration that it may have stood well above the high water mark in 1620, no prudent mariner would try to bring a ship alongside a boulder on a heaving December sea when a sheltered inlet beckoned from nearby. Indeed, it is doubtful that the Pilgrims even noticed Plymouth Rock. No mention of the rock is found among any of the surviving documents and letters of the age, and it doesn't make its first recorded appearance until 1715, almost a century later. Not until about the time Miss Hemans wrote her swooping epic did Plymouth Rock become indelibly associated with the landing of the Pilgrims. Wherever they first trod, we can assume that the 102 Pilgrims stepped from their storm-tossed little ship with unsteady legs and huge relief. They had just spent 9.5 damp and perilous weeks at sea, crammed together on a creaking vessel about the size of a modern double-decker bus. The crew, with the customary graciousness of sailors, referred to them as puke stockings on account of their apparently boundless ability to spatter the latter with the former, though in fact they had handled the experience reasonably well. Only 1 passenger had died en route, and 2 had been added through births, one of whom revelled ever after in the exuberant name of Oceanus Hopkins. Goodness. They called themselves saints. Those members of the party who were not saints they called strangers. Pilgrims, in reference to these early voyages, would not become common for another 200 years, nor, strictly speaking, is it correct to call them Puritans. They were separatists, so called because they had left the Church of England. Puritans were those who remained in the Anglican Church but wished to purify. They would not arrive in America for another decade. But when they did, they would quickly eclipse and eventually absorb this little original colony. It would be difficult to imagine a group of people more ill-suited to a life in the wilderness. They packed as if they had misunderstood the purpose of the trip. They found room for sundials and candle snuffers, a drum, a trumpet, and a complete history of Turkey. William Mullins packed 126 pairs of shoes and 13 pairs of boots. Yet between them they failed to bring a single cow or horse or plough or fishing line. Among the professions represented on the Mayflower's manifest were 2 tailors, a printer, several merchants, a silk worker, a shopkeeper and a hatter, occupations whose importance is not immediately evident when one thinks of surviving in a hostile environment. Their military commander, Miles Standish, was so diminutive of stature that he was known to all as Captain Shrimpy, hardly a figure to inspire awe in the savage natives whom they confidently expected to encounter. With the uncertain exception of the little captain, probably none in the party had ever tried to bring down a wild animal. Hunting in 17th century Europe was a sport reserved for the aristocracy. Even those who labelled themselves farmers generally had scant practical knowledge of husbandry, since farmer in the 1600s, and for some time afterwards, signified an owner of land rather than one who worked it. They were, in short, dangerously unprepared for the rigours ahead, and they demonstrated their manifest incompetence in the most dramatic possible way, by dying in droves. 6 expired in the first 2 weeks, 8 the next month, 17 more in February, and a further 13 in March. By April, when the Mayflower set sail back to England, just 54 people, nearly half of them children, were left to begin the long work of turning this tenuous toehold into a self-sustaining colony. At this remove, it is difficult to conceive just how alone this small, hapless band of adventurers was. Their nearest kindred neighbours at Jamestown in Virginia, and at a small and now all but forgotten colony at Cooper's, now Cupid's Cove in Newfoundland, were 500 miles off in opposite directions. At their back stood a hostile ocean, and before them lay an inconceivably vast and unknown continent of wild and savage hue, in William Bradford's uneasy words. They were about as far from the comforts of civilization as anyone had ever been, certainly as far as anyone had ever been without a fishing line. For 2 months they tried to make contact with the natives, but every time they spotted any, the Indians ran off. Then one day in February, a young brave of friendly mien approached a party of pilgrims on a beach. His name was Samoset, and he was a stranger in the region himself, but he had a friend named Tisquantum from the local Wampanoag tribe, to whom he introduced them. Samoset and Tisquantum became the pilgrims' fast friends. They showed them how to plant corn and catch wildfowl, and helped them to establish friendly relations with the local sachem or chief. Before long, as every school child knows, the pilgrims were thriving, and Indians and settlers were sitting down to a cordial Thanksgiving feast. Life was grand. A question that naturally arises is how they managed this. Algonquian, the language of the eastern tribes, is an extraordinarily complex and agglomerative tongue, or more accurately, family of tongues, full of formidable consonant clusters that are all but unpronounceable to the untutored, as we can see from the first primer of Algonquian speech, prepared some 20 years later by Roger Williams in Connecticut. A feat of scholarship deserving of far wider fame, incidentally. Try saying the following and you may get some idea of the challenge. Nuquit Pausukawashtuwaman means there are 100 of us. Chenyok Wonkupiyatuman means when will you return? And I'm sorry I'm butchering this, by the way. Tashukun Kumachawan Chanamas means how long have you been sick? Letana Tatamin, I will be going. Clearly this was not a language you could pick up in a weekend, and the pilgrims were hardly gifted linguists. They weren't even comfortable with Tisquantum's name. They called him Squanto. The answer, surprisingly glossed over by most of the history books, is that the pilgrims didn't have to learn Algonquin for the happy and convenient reason that Somerset and Squanto spoke English. Somerset spoke it only a little, but Squanto spoke English with total assurance, and Spanish into the bargain. That a straggling band of English settlers could in 1620 cross a vast ocean and find a pair of Indians able to welcome them in their own tongue seems little short of miraculous, doesn't it just? It was certainly lucky. The pilgrims would very probably have perished or been slaughtered without them, but not as wildly improbable as it at first seems. The fact is that in 1620 the New World wasn't really so new at all.